Hello and welcome. I'm Austin Koplarchik, composer and arranger, bringing you episode 21 of my book review series. And today we'll be discussing music as propaganda, art to persuade, art to control. So, I picked this up recently from the library, and it's a neat little read. That's why I want to talk about it. And I really enjoy the tagline, art to persuade, art to control. It's a good touch. It's a really good touch. And before you ask, no, the book is not a primer on how to use music as propaganda, which really put a damper on my world domination concept, going on there where I was going to mind control people. Instead, it was just a fairly nice read on the history of music as a tool of propaganda. Who would have guessed? So while typically I discuss the author right off the bat here, I couldn't find much about Arnold Perris, other than what Google would tell me, that he's a professor emeritus of music at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and that he holds degrees in political science and musicology. He's had articles appear in Ethnomusicology, Imago Musicae, and other journals on top of that. But, this was published in 1985, so he's probably had a long retirement by this point, which, good for him, honestly. Speaking of this book, today's subject is broken into 9 different sections. In order, they are messages in music, people without power, music nationalism in Europe, 1830 to 1920, Wagner, a certain Austrian painter, and the German race, music for the totalitarian state, Marx, Lenin, and Soviet Russia, more totalitarian music, Confucius, Marx, and Mao Zedong, sacred or profane, music and religion, the hidden rostrum of opera and the Broadway musical, the decade of protests, popular music in the 1960s, and finally, the contemporary composer as social critic. Chapter 1, Messages in Music, lays the kind of groundwork I think is rather important for this type of book, explaining Paris's definition and understanding of propaganda, and includes, I think, actually the only image of sheet music in the whole 248-page book, which, interesting. Chapter 2, People Without Power, Musical Nationalism in Europe, 1830 to 1920, discusses those who found themselves victims of tyranny, poverty, or intellectual oppression. The music of Chopin, the music of Franz Liszt, the music of Bedřich Smetana? The words. Sorry. And all those composers who found it necessary to compose with the spirit of their homeland while being stuck either far away or beneath something that they couldn't control. Chapter 3, Wagner, Mustache Man whose name I can't say, and the German race, discusses the music and philosophy of Wagner, and some of the effects it had on the development of musical culture of the period of Germany between 1933 and 1945 that I don't think YouTube lets me talk about. Which, not going to say those words. It's an interesting dive into some of the extra musical philosophy of Richard Wagner and the other guy, I guess. Chapter 4 is Music for the Totalitarian State, Marx, Lenin, and Soviet Russia, which discusses, as you can probably imagine, how music was treated in Soviet Russia up until the early 1980s, because the book published. Which is pretty fun, because it talks about the Soviet Union in, present terms, and that always gets kind of a giggle out of me, because the Soviet Union has been collapsed longer than I've been alive, so that's always a fun one. The chapter talks a lot about Shostakovich, the philosophy of revolutionary art in the Soviet Union, in the USSR, and basically just how the USSR's censorship of music kind of worked up until the 1980s. Chapter 5, More Totalitarian Music, Confucius, Marx, and Mao Zedong. I know this may shock some of you, but this is basically an extension of the last chapter. Discusses the same thing, however kind of through the lens of communist China, rather than that of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. There are some interesting differences, primarily in how music censorship was approached, and how things were accepted at different rates between changes in leadership, specifically directly post-Mao Zedong. Other than that, the chapters are fairly similar. There's the Marxist view on music, which is kind of the dominating concept for most of this. And then chapter 6, otherwise known as Sacred or Profane, Music and Religion, discusses how musical control and propaganda was approached by 3 different religions: Catholicism, Islam, and Hinduism. There are some fascinating differences between the 3, even though Islam and Christianity do have a lot of similarities due to both being Abrahamic religions with the same kind of base source, I would say. Hinduism is, unsurprisingly, the odd man out in most of this, just due to the lack of physical proximity, and the fact that it is also not an Abrahamic religion, and thus does not share any source material with Islam or Catholicism and Christianity. So yeah. Chapter 7 touches on the social commentary offered up by a lot of later operas and early Broadway musicals to, I guess, or mid-20th century Broadway musicals, again, published in 1985. It's pretty straightforward as far as things go. It doesn't really touch a lot on philosophical concepts that are touched on in more of the earlier chapters, which I'll discuss that in my opinion. Chapter 8, The Decade of Protest, Popular Music in the 1960s, takes a very similar lens on the socially aware music of the later 1960s. We're not talking about Frank Sinatra and Elvis being recorded at the start of the 1960s. We're talking about later parts of the Beatles, hippie rock movement, the Aztec rock movement, all that kind of stuff that I'm sure all of us know and love. Definitely me, who is 21. This section, again, I think struggles kind of with this lack of philosophical context, really. And it just touches on so many things so quickly. But there's a lot more to touch on in the history of popular music in the 1960s than there is in, Shostakovich's life story. That's a single guy. Instead, in this chapter, boom, 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 artist, song, recording, bam. A lot more of a overview than as in-depth as the previous chapters have gone. Chapter 9, The Contemporary Composer as Social Critic, feels a lot like a recap of the previous few, but it's done through the lens of comparing the work of Dmitri Shostakovich and that of Hans Werner Henze, who is a composer I was not familiar with before this book, and I'm still not very familiar with, so I do apologize if I butcher his name. It contrasts their work, their political ideals, and especially the environments in which they grew up. Shostakovich, of course, being in the USSR, very specific composing style there. Henze did grow up in the later part of Germany, I believe, and saw some of those at an age where he could still comprehend and recognize that. But after that, much more freedom, lived in Italy for a while, lived in Cuba for a year. A lot of stuff. Yeah, and it uses some of these points to kind of recapitulate some of the earlier themes of chapters, modulating them to the original key of the discussion to end the book. Sonata-form reference. And that's essentially the whole book. Now, onto availability. I would not have believed this when I picked this up in my library. Notice the library thing. But this is, hard to find. I saw, 10 copies of this on the internet, and they're all, $100. That's crazy. This thing is tiny. I checked my own copy out, obviously, from my school library. Gentle reminder to use libraries. Public libraries are there for a reason. Use them. And that was basically, the only chance, I guess, I would have had to find this, because, expensive. There's few copies for sale on the internet. And I guess it is kind of a niche book. So, if you really want a copy of this, and you want to drop $100, that's fair. Try an interlibrary loan. Libraries do offer that service where they'll get books for you from somewhere else. I did that with a different book over here somewhere. But to end everything out, we'll discuss my opinion. Now, I did something a little different for this review. While searching for Arnold Perris and some information on him, I did something I normally don't do in the course of one of these reviews. I read a review of the book from somebody else. Now, I normally try to avoid reading other reviews because I don't want that to pollute my thoughts and to pollute what I'm trying to give you as my view of the book. But I think that this one was an interesting one because it completely disagreed with everything I thought about the book. I took the time to read through these 2 pages submitted by Joshua Kosman from the University of California, Berkeley at the time. I believe he might be a music critic journalist with San Francisco something now. Can't confirm that. This was submitted to the Music Library Association's journal, Notes, in 1987, so about 2 years after its publication. What Kosman writes is an absolutely scathing review, doing all but lambasting the book, claiming that, he relied too heavily on secondary sources, that he doesn't go in depth enough on the actual musical content that make it effective as propaganda. I found this kind of important to mention because in writing that review, I feel that Kosman completely missed what the book was going for. Yes, I do think that Perris didn't actually interact with the musical theory of any of this, which I guess I didn't expect him to do, and I don't think was his intention at all. Was this to be a purely musicological look at music as propaganda tool? Yeah, there would have been very little reason for Perris to focus as he did on the philosophical underpinnings of a lot of the time period and what was going on. Perris wrote much of this, in my opinion, to discuss the effects of politics on music as it relates to the culture and development of culture in the specific times and places he chose to discuss. I felt really no need for him to give me like a harmonic analysis of Beethoven's Fidelio to prove that its themes would not have been attractive to the Napoleonic officers who had occupied Vienna a week before. But the explanation of the themes in the libretto, and how they would not have connected with the very recent occupiers of Vienna, was a fascinating read, and I think an important one as well. I can concede to Kosman that Perris did cite a great deal many sources. However, I don't feel like that should really be a problem, as he kind of makes it out to be. He makes this very specific point about how most of Perris's sources, all of Perris's sources, are in English. Okay, yeah, I would assume that is because Perris probably speaks English. When I'm writing a paper, I primarily look for English sources on this kind of concept because I speak English. It's very hard for me to cite a German or French article, even with today's machine translation, because I'm not certain how accurate it is and how well I could translate it personally. So I feel like that comment on the restriction, I find that argument strange, slightly. And I feel like the argument in general, I'm just citing so many sources, because I know he's trying to call doubt onto one of them because of that English restriction, but quite honestly, I just don't see it. Granted, I'm not a great literary music critic, just a guy with a YouTube channel giving you his opinion on books. And in my opinion, the book was a fascinating read, and I had a good time with it. You know, I don't think it was the strongest of points, particularly Chapter 8, and the focus on hens in Chapter 9, just because I'm not that familiar with his work. I did still enjoy my time with it. And, well, I'm not going to go out there and recommend go buy this, just because, you know, 10 copies available, super expensive. If you want to find this for a read, search for your local library, see if they can get you a copy to look at. If you enjoyed it, feel free to use the YouTube like, subscribe buttons to show me that. And if you have an idea on, you know, politics and music, if they should mix, if they shouldn't mix, I'm not going to get into that debate. I'd love to hear your thoughts, though. Or if you have thoughts or experience with music being used as propaganda tools in the past. I mean, I'm sure we can all think of one great example of that, and that's the McDonald's jingle, because that is stuck in my head. That's propaganda, because now I want a burger. But, yes, I'd love to hear from you regardless in the comment section with your thoughts on the topic. And that's all. So, thanks. I'll see you next time.